In 1492, the world stood on the edge of change. No one knew that a small fleet sailing into the Atlantic would forever alter the course of human history. Christopher Columbus sailed west, hoping to reach Asia. Instead, he was about to encounter something far greater than he had ever imagined. At the time, Europeans did not truly know the shape of the world, or what lay beyond the ocean. Their maps were incomplete, and the unknown inspired both fear and curiosity. This voyage would lead to far more than the discovery of new lands. It would raise empires, destroy civilizations, and lay the foundations of the modern world. For centuries, Europe's wealth depended on the East. Silk, spices, and precious goods traveled thousands of kilometers before reaching European markets. After the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, Europe's trade routes changed dramatically. Commerce with the East became more expensive and increasingly difficult. Europe's kingdoms searched for another solution. If the overland routes to Asia had become difficult, perhaps the ocean offered a new path. Portugal explored the coast of Africa. At the same time, Spain prepared to support a far bolder idea, sailing west across the Atlantic. For years, many rulers rejected Columbus's proposal, but in 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain decided to give him one final chance. Columbus believed the Earth was smaller than it actually was. He was convinced that sailing west would lead directly to Asia. In August 1492, the Santa Maria, Pinta, and Nina left the harbor. No one aboard knew what awaited them beyond the Atlantic. Columbus was searching for Asia. Instead, his voyage would unknowingly change the destiny of two worlds forever. Days turned into weeks. As the ships crossed the endless Atlantic, the crew slowly began to lose hope. Many sailors demanded to return. Others believed only death awaited beyond the ocean. The threat of mutiny grew stronger each day. Columbus refused to change course. He remained convinced that land lay ahead and persuaded his crew to continue. On the morning of October 12, 1492, the long-awaited moment arrived. Land appeared on the horizon. The crew believed they had reached Asia, but they had actually arrived at the threshold of an entirely new continent. On October 12, 1492, Columbus and his crew landed on an island in the Bahamas. Yet they still believed they had reached the eastern shores of Asia. The island was home to the Taino people. They welcomed the newcomers peacefully, offering food, water, and small gifts. What caught Columbus's attention most was gold. Every rumor of greater riches pushed him to continue exploring. Columbus continued exploring the islands for months. Without realizing it, he had opened the gateway to an entirely new world for Europe. After months at sea, Columbus returned to Spain. His news electrified not only the royal court, but all of Europe. Columbus presented gold, exotic plants, and stories from the newly discovered lands. Spain now believed even greater discoveries were within reach. Columbus's return sparked a new age of exploration. Spain launched expedition after expedition, and the Atlantic became a gateway to opportunity rather than a barrier. Before long, Spain was no longer alone. Other European kingdoms would soon join the race to claim the riches of the New World. After Columbus returned, Spain and Portugal both claimed the newly discovered lands. Europe's two greatest maritime powers stood on the brink of conflict. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas produced an extraordinary decision. Most of the still unknown world was divided between two kingdoms. Under the treaty, Portugal focused on routes through Africa toward Asia, while Spain expanded westward into the newly discovered lands. The treaty would have an unexpected consequence. Before long, Portugal would reach a vast land on the eastern coast of South America, territory that would become Brazil. In 1500, Portuguese navigator Pedro Álvares Cabral sailed across the Atlantic on his way to India, but unexpected winds carried his fleet farther west than planned. The vast coastline on the horizon belonged to eastern South America. By chance, Portugal had made one of the greatest discoveries in its history. Portugal claimed the land for its crown. Under the Treaty of Tordesillas, Brazil officially became part of the Portuguese Empire. The two maritime empires now followed different paths. Portugal focused on global trade routes, while Spain prepared to push deeper into the Americas. Only a few decades after Columbus's voyage, Spanish explorers reached the heart of the Americas. There they encountered one of the greatest civilizations of the age, the mighty Aztec Empire. In Iwu-Yi-Jo, Hernán-Cortes, and only a few hundred soldiers, began one of history's boldest expeditions. Though vastly outnumbered, they set their sights on the powerful Aztec Empire. Emperor Moctezuma too watched the newcomers carefully. The first meetings appeared peaceful, but neither side truly understood the other's intentions. Gold captured the Spaniards' attention above all else. That wealth would soon ignite one of the greatest conquests in history. Cortes did not fight alone. Many indigenous nations that opposed Aztec rule joined the Spanish. Their alliance would change the course of history. In 1521, Tenochtitlan came under siege. After weeks of relentless fighting, one of the greatest cities in the Americas began to fall. War was only part of the disaster. Disease and famine devastated the empire as well. The mighty Aztec state disappeared into history. With the fall of the Aztec Empire, Spain took its first great step toward becoming the dominant colonial power in the New World. But this was only the beginning. Far to the south, an even larger empire still stood. After the fall of the Aztec Empire, Spanish ambitions turned south. High in the Andes stood one of the greatest civilizations of the Americas, the Inca Empire. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro entered Inca territory with only a few hundred soldiers. Waiting ahead was an empire of millions. Emperor Atahualpa agreed to meet the strangers. But what seemed like diplomacy would become one of history's greatest ambushes. The attack at Cajamarca lasted only a few hours. Atahualpa was captured, and the fate of the Inca Empire was changed forever. To secure his freedom, Atahualpa offered one of the greatest ransoms in history. He promised to fill one room with gold and two more with silver. 4 months, Inca treasures were collected. Priceless works of art were melted into gold bars, ready to be shipped across the Atlantic. Despite the ransom being paid, Atahualpa was never released. After a brief trial, he was executed, leaving the Inca leadership in ruins. With the fall of the Inca Empire, Spain became the dominant power across much of the Americas. These conquests transformed not only continents, but also the global balance of wealth and power. Spain gained far more than new territories. Gold and silver flowing from the Americas began to reshape the global economy. Precious metals were not the only things crossing the Atlantic. Potatoes, maize, tomatoes, cacao, and tobacco transformed European agriculture and daily life forever. In return, horses, cattle, wheat, and new farming practices reached the Americas. The two continents were now transforming one another forever. Farsala at the greatest cost was paid by the indigenous peoples. Diseases brought from Europe claimed millions of lives, permanently transforming the population of the Americas. Spain's enormous wealth did not go unnoticed. Soon, England, France, and the Netherlands also crossed the Atlantic, determined to claim their share of the New World. In 1607, England founded Jamestown, its first permanent colony in North America. This small settlement marked the beginning of a nation yet to be born. In 1620, the Pilgrims arrived aboard the Mayflower and settled at Plymouth. Their search for religious freedom helped fuel the rapid growth of England's colonies. Over the following decades, the English colonies spread rapidly along the Atlantic coast. Their expansion would soon lead to a decisive struggle with France for control of North America. By the mid-18th century, North America was divided between two great European powers. Britain dominated the eastern coast, while France controlled the vast interior. War erupted in 1754. Britain and France were not alone. Both sides fought alongside indigenous allies in a struggle that would shape the future of North America. The fall of Quebec in 1759 changed the course of the war. Soon after, France was forced to surrender most of its North American territories to Britain. Britain had won the war, but victory came at an enormous cost. To pay its massive debts, the British government turned its attention to the American colonies. After the war, Britain faced enormous debt. The government in London decided that the American colonies should help pay the cost of victory. The new taxes sparked outrage across the colonies. The colonists believed it was unjust to be taxed by a parliament in which they had no representation. In 1773, hundreds of chests of tea were thrown into Boston Harbor. The protest became an open challenge to British authority. The chances for compromise were fading fast. The colonies began preparing for war, and within a few years, one of history's most significant struggles for independence would begin. On the morning of April 19, 1775, two armies faced each other at Lexington, Massachusetts. No one knew that within minutes, history would change forever. When the first shots were fired, there was no turning back. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Representatives of the colonies gathered once again in Philadelphia. Their goal was no longer simply to defend their rights, but to shape a common future. Congress created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander. Ahead lay a long and difficult war against one of the world's most powerful empires. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia to proclaim not just a rebellion, but the birth of a new nation. Written by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that people possess fundamental rights. Once the signatures were placed on the document, there was no turning back. The 13 colonies had formally declared their separation from the British Empire. The Declaration of Independence was more than the founding document of the United States. It became one of history's most influential statements on popular sovereignty and individual rights, inspiring democratic movements around the world. After years of war, the decisive moment arrived. In 1781, American and French forces surrounded the British Army at Yorktown. The surrender of General Charles Cornwallis changed the course of the war. Britain had largely lost its chance to regain control of the colonies. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognized the independence of the United States. After years of conflict, a new nation had entered the world stage. The war had been won, but the greatest challenge was only beginning. The young republic now had to transform its hard-won independence into a stable and enduring nation. Independence had been won, but the new nation still needed a government. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to draft one of the most influential constitutional systems in modern history. The new constitution established a balance between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, creating a strong federal government for the young republic. In 1789, George Washington took the oath as the first president of the United States. The new nation had become a functioning state, not just an idea. America's story did not end here. Ahead lay westward expansion, civil war, and the rise of a global superpower. That journey continues in America, Part 2.